Hi, I am Grace Yu, the board chair of the 1990 Institute. I'd like to thank you for spending your precious Saturday morning with us. The 1990 Institute is a 501c3 nonprofit, and our mission is to champion fair and equitable treatment for Asian Americans in a constructive US-China relationship through leadership, education, and collaborations. This workshop, which started in 2013, is a key program of the Institute. The focus of today's workshop is about the Asian American history and experience. We'll start by introducing foundational materials about the Asian American journey and their struggle for identity, and then delve into Asian Americans' contribution to civil rights by examining several legal cases that set the legal precedents for all Americans. Our goal is to provide you with knowledge and resources for you to gain a deeper understanding into Asian Americans. For our educators, we designed this workshop to include classroom development, lesson development discussions. And we also have a portal to share additional information with you. And the link to that portal will be put in the chat box later. And we also like you to share ideas of what you would like to know more of and suggestions for improvements for the future so that we can improve our workshops and we put out more workshops for the future for you. Now, I'd like to introduce you to Sandra Pan, the chair of this workshop. She's instrumental in bringing this workshop online so that we may make it available to participants outside of California. And I'm very pleased to announce that we have participants from 33 states at today's workshop. Now let's turn the spotlight to Sandra Pan. And I hope you find this workshop informative and useful. Thank you.
Thank you, Grace, and welcome. The term missing in history was coined by Helen Zia, an author and activist. We're grateful to share this phrase with you. For this workshop, we're presenting factually accurate information and hope this will bring a more complete narrative of American history into our classroom. We have a lot to cover. Here's our schedule for the day. Feel free to send your questions in the Q&A box and throughout the presentation, and jot down your teaching ideas into the Jamboard. Enough said. You're here to listen to the subject matter experts. First up is Lok Siu. You can read all about Lok and her teaching career, but what you do not know is Lok is a first-generation Asian American and lived in 2 continents before finally calling America her home. There's no one better to talk about Asian American migration and history than Lok. The screen is yours, Professor Siu. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure for me to present the first part of this session, which is on the making of Asian Americans. And the goals for this 45-minute talk is really to encourage cultural understanding, highlight some of the core concepts in ethnic studies, promote critical thinking, understanding of Asian American history through the different waves of immigration, also understanding the challenges and accomplishments of Asian Americans. Overall, just to elevate the visibility of Asian Americans and increase overall understanding of this complex and diverse group. So I'm going to start by first talking a little bit about the term itself, Asian American. We take it for granted now. We use it so often without thinking about where the term actually came from. And here it really arose in 1968. When student activists at UC Berkeley founded the organization called Asian American Political Alliance, APA for short. And the term was used to build a broad collective identity among people of diverse Asian descent. Asian Americans before this time was actually called Orientals. And, that is a derogatory term, Oriental, which is really steeped in colonial history of the West in Asia. So Asian American is a self-identification, and it represents a social and political term to describe a diverse group of people of Asian descent. See, so just to give you a background and demographics of Asian Americans, who are we dealing with here? What is the group, the scale, the scope? And just to give you a sense, currently Asian Americans make up 6% of the entire US population. California has the highest Asian American population at 6.5 million, followed by New York at 1.6 million, then Texas at 1.8 and 1.6 million. And by 2055, Asian Americans are projected to be the largest immigrant group at 36%. This would be outpacing the Latinx community as an immigrant group. And 10 years later, in 2065, Asian Americans will make up 12% of the US population. So between now and 2065, we're looking at a doubling of the Asian American population in the United States. Here's a little bit of a breakdown of the different groups. As I mentioned, of the 6% Asian American population that are Asian American in the US, that makes about 23 million Asian Americans. And I also included the calculations, the demographics for Native Hawaiians and other PIs who comprise about 1.6 million. Now, this 23 million Asian Americans really is an extremely diverse group that is composed of 50 different ethnic groups and over 200 language groups. And among that diverse, category umbrella group, 6 groups make up 85% of all Asian Americans. And you'll see here on the graph, on the very top, Chinese, Asian Indians, Filipino, Vietnamese, Korean, and Japanese, really are the largest groups here among the Asian American population. And you should know also that 6 in 10 Asian Americans are immigrants. So they're first generation Americans in that sense. And Asian Americans also have the widest income gap of any group, meaning there are people at the very top of the income bracket, but also people at the lowest part or bracket of the income category. And that, that Asian Americans are really have this largest, widest income gap of any racial ethnic group in the United States. In terms of just of the spread of Asian Americans by state, this mapping gives you a sense of where what states have what largest groups of Asians, ethnic groups. And you'll see that in California, in New York, they're primarily Chinese, but you'll see also South Asians or Asian Indians. They're located in green in the southern parts, Eastern and Middle America. And then you also have Filipinos, Vietnamese, and the Hmong population throughout mostly the central United States. So that gives you a breakdown. So how did Asian Americans actually, come, when did they come over? How did they come over? I'll spend a little bit of time talking about that, the ebbs and flows of Asian migration. So I think most of us, when we think of Asian American migration, we think of the 1800s, the gold rush, right? But in actuality, Asian Americans came to the US much earlier than that. And, as early as the late 1700s and perhaps even earlier, but this is what we have documented. Most of this group that came over during this period came over, as sailors and as and merchants, and landing mostly on the East Coast, southern parts of the United States in the port cities. Remember this time, this is the maritime era, of sailing. And this is where you begin to see sprinklings of groups scattered all over the east and southern coast of the US. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. The next wave of Asian migration came then in the mid to late 1800s, is what our common understanding is of the Chinese gold miners that came over, the merchants that came over to California and all over the West Coast. And then shortly after that, followed by a large influx of labor migration that continue consecutively, with different ethnic Asian groups coming to the Western area and then spreading to the central area. We also have a pretty hard stop in terms of Asian labor exclusion. And this really began in 1875 and increased, to the 1920s, where almost all Asians were excluded. And that was not lifted. The exclusion laws were not lifted until really the 1950s. And then we have another wave of major Asian migration beginning in 1965 to present, with the enactment of a new Immigration Act. And this is where we begin to see a much more diverse group of Asian Americans coming into the United States. And there were preference categories, primarily around skilled laborers and also around family members for reunification. And we also, of course, have the refugee population from the 1960s and 70s. So this is where you begin to see a much more diverse group of Asian Americans coming into the United States. That is still current today. So focusing a little bit on the early Asian immigrants, the sailors of the 1700s, they came again mostly in the port cities in the East Coast and the South, and they're primarily made up of Filipinos, Bengalis, and also the Chinese. And here we have a very early image in the 1760s of a town, that is called the Manila town, or St. Malo in Louisiana. And they began to set up these small villages, shrimping, fishing villages in Louisiana. And even today, there are currently 12,000 people of Filipinx descent in Louisiana. As soon as they arrived, they intermixed with people in the area. And you also have Chinese coming among the group from China, and also Chinese Filipinos that settled in these camps and are still present in Louisiana today. We also had Bengali sailors, who are also known as Lascars. Lascars are a term for sailors at the time, and they were sailing primarily, with the British colonial ships that were coming along the East Coast. And you begin to see populations all along the East Coast, as far up as Pennsylvania, Boston, and also in Baltimore. And they were involved in the trade routes, between India and China. I should also note the part about the Filipino sailors that came over. Many of them were sailing with the Spanish galleons, to Latin America, to the Caribbean, and many of them were jumping ship and then landing in Louisiana, just to give you that whole interconnected migration, from Asia to the Americas more generally. But these two groups are, coming over as sailors that were operating on ships that enabled trade between the continents. Then we also have the labor migrations that were coming over in the 1800s, the mid 1800s. And we began to see them, showing up in California, of course. They also came over to work on mines, the railroads, and then followed by agriculture. And we have large populations of ethnic Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, South Asians, followed by Filipino laborers that were coming to this region. Just before this labor migration, I should note, is the gold rush, right? This is between 1848 and in the early 1850s. And many of the Chinese miners were coming over to mine gold. Many of them came over also to start small businesses to service this new immigrant group. So you begin to see sort of Chinese restaurants, Chinese trade, grocery stores, and Chinese launders, et cetera, showing up as early as the mid 1800s. At the time, California was still fairly unpopulated. You still were seeing the migration, from the East Coast, from Europe, and the Chinese at that time actually made up about 30% of all immigrants in California. And they were, that's pretty much about 20% of the total California population at the time. So this was not, a small group by any means. They actually made up quite a large group in California. And you should also note that that almost as early as the 1850s, they began to establish a head tax, on the Chinese as well, to try to really decrease that migration, or at least get some taxation out of that migration. Once the gold miners came and then slowly, slowed down with that migration, we had laborers that were heavily recruited from Asia. And you begin to see this as early as the 1860s. You'll remember that beginning in 1863 with the Proclamation of Emancipation, this is where we began to see the institution of slavery ending. And a drop, in sort of access to slave labor, and also, when you think about it, to replenish that labor need, the U.S. began to heavily recruit other sources of labor, primarily looking to Asia. And so, in 1860s, you begin to see over 20,000 Chinese being recruited to the West Coast, primarily working to establish infrastructures like the railroad, right? This is one thing that we associate with the Chinese laborers in California, is with the railroads. And that is also true for agricultural work all over, starting from as, far up as Seattle, all the way down to the southern coast, of California. Almost as soon as the Chinese came over, you begin to see anti-Asian, the rise of anti-Asian hate, anti-Chinese hate. So, you also had a shift then, once the Chinese came over, they shifted toward the Japanese and the Koreans in the 1880s, with heavy recruitment of them coming in as also agricultural workers. And in the 1900s, we began to see South Asians being recruited into the West Coast as well as agricultural workers. And they're still heavily populated, in California, in the Central California areas, and also the Imperial County in Southern California. And that migration also then flowed into, went into Filipino recruitment in 1920s and 1930s. And with each of these waves, you begin to see, further and further enactments of exclusion acts, and a rise of anti-Asian sentiments, mobilizations, and violence against each of these groups, until, really, they begin to sort of decrease to a point where it dissipates. And you have in 1942 the enactment of the Bracero program to bring in Mexican laborers to replace, again, the demand of labor. So you see this connection, of interracial connection between enslaved Black labor to Asian labor to Latinx labor. As I mentioned before, there were exclusion acts that were instituted as early as 1875, beginning with the Page Act. And we often think of the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act as the first act that prohibited immigration of Chinese laborers. But in actuality, a few years before that, this law was imposed against Chinese women laborers. And in both these cases, these are the first immigrant acts that used race, as a central concept, as a form of exclusion. There were no other exclusion acts before that was based on race. And it wasn't, and there are various minor acts, following 1882 that expanded the exclusion, against Japanese Americans and et cetera, until in 1924, the Immigration Act, also known as the Johnson-Reed Act, that excluded, Asians by virtue of race or nationality that were ineligible for US citizenship. So basically, the Asians the entire Asian population were excluded because of the Nationality Acts of 1790 and 1866 basically excluded people of Asian lineage from naturalization, pretty much excluding them from the eligibility of becoming US citizens. So, when we think of the creation of Asian Americans as a perpetual foreigner, the idea of it really kind of came from the laws themselves that excluded Asians from becoming citizens and were always considered as resident aliens, right? These acts and laws did not happen in a vacuum. In many ways, they emerged in the environment of anti-Asian hate and anti-Asian violence in the US history. And you begin to see this in the 1870s throughout to present. But for now, I'm just going to bracket it and talk about the anti-violence in the 1870s to 1950s. And here again, 1870s and 1880s, you had anti-Chinese riots that were attacking Chinese populations and attacking the Chinatowns, the emerging Chinatowns that were popping up in different parts of the United States. You also begin to see the rise of anti-South Asian riots in Seattle and other places as well. I'm just highlighting some of the more high-profile cases that are documented in history. In the 1930s, you had anti-Filipino riots. 1940s, of course, we had the Japanese American internment incarceration. And then 1950s with McCarthyism and anti-Chinese sentiments as well. During this period, there were also anti-miscegenation laws that were enacted on the state level. And here just gives you a map of when they were repealed. In some places, there were no laws enacted, and those are the gray, the ones colored in gray. The ones in green, the anti-miscegenation laws were repealed by 1888. The ones in yellow, they began to be repealed between the period of 1948 and 1967. And then in the red, the ones that are colored in red, they were not overturned until 1967. So just think about these anti-miscegenation laws were in place, which prevented Asians from marrying with primarily whites, but the law, in fact, stated anti-miscegenation, which is cross-racial, but it was the enforcement of which really was around Asian and white populations. What that created then, both on the part of the Exclusion Acts, but also on the part of anti-miscegenation acts, is what you begin to see, for instance, what we know as the bachelor societies. Here are archival images of, on the left, of bachelor societies emerging in San Francisco and California and all over the East Coast, the West Coast, where the Exclusion Acts against Chinese women were enacted in 1875, and the Anti-Miscegenation Acts were enacted. So the Chinese men and Asian men that came over during this period were not able to intermarry with broadly with the population. So there you see emergence of the bachelor societies, but then you also had populations like the Punjabi South Asian community that were intermixing with the Mexican community in the Imperial Valley. So, there were populations of mixed race families emerging as early as the late 1800s and early 1900s all over the western part of the United States as well. Again, the repeal of Asian exclusion laws really began as late as the 1952. It's also beginning in that period when Asians were able to naturalize as US citizens. So this is where you begin to see Asians becoming citizens and then being able to apply for immigration, for family members to come over. And as well to own land, etc. It wasn't until 1965 with the Immigration and Naturalization Act that repealed this quota system, and it prioritized skilled labor, family reunification. We also had a refugee population coming in. And what we see today as a much more diversified Asian American community is really the effect of the 1965 Immigration Act and subsequent acts following that. And just to give you an idea, of the post-1960s immigration, here, was a concerted effort in the 1960s to recruit highly skilled labor. So here there was a recruitment from Taiwan, from Hong Kong, India, the Philippines, and other places where you begin to see, skilled labor such as nurses and doctors, engineers, people in various master's and graduate degrees going into research of all kinds. So, here are just, again, pictures that might be recognizable to some of you. The Filipino nurses that we know of today are continuing to fill those spaces and needs in the United States. On the top right corner is Dr. Wenho Lee, also an engineer that had experienced anti-Asian charges of being espionage, but was proven to be innocent. Again, he came over as an engineer working in Los Alamos lab from Taiwan. On the lower two pictures, of course, you recognize our Vice President, Kamala Harris, whose mother came over as part of that group as well, as a graduate student at UC Berkeley. And then on the left is Jerry Yang of Yahoo. He's a descendant. His father came over as well as part of this group of highly skilled labor class of Asian immigrants. Another group of immigrants, of course, recruited in the post-1960s, not recruited, but enabled by the law, was family reunification. This is when you begin to see, an increase in different kinds of Chinatowns, emerging, or Asian populations in Asian towns emerging. You have Flushing's New York Chinatown that is different from the Manhattan Chinatown that came as a result of 1960s. You also had, Houston, Texas malls emerging, San Gabriel Valley in California, that little Vietnams or Saigons, Thai centers, Koreans, Korean towns, etc., really came, in this post 1960s period. Some of them came over as the skilled laborers category, but many of them came to reunified with families, and that's where you also see a separate flow of migrants coming in as different kinds of laborers, beyond the skilled laboring groups. Also among the post-1960s immigrant groups is the Southeast Asian refugees. Now you remember the US involvement in Southeast Asia, which also brought over large groups of refugees, from Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, among other sort of areas there. And they're primarily known as, the refugees, the Bo people. Many of them were settled in the Midwest and the South and other parts of California. So you'll remember that the map that I showed earlier in terms of where many of the Southeast Asian refugees are still located today, they're, in the Midwest, the southern parts of the United States, although many of them, after settling, have moved around quite a bit throughout the United States. What you should know then, in some ways, this kind of expansion of the Asian American population, the diversity is not only reflected ethnically and nationally in terms of where they're from, but also in income disparities, right? I had mentioned earlier that the Asian Americans have the widest gap in income disparity. And here you see in this graph showing the extent to which there is such a gap, right? On the top end of the median household income of groups among Asian origin are Indians at around 119,000 in terms of income. But at the very end of the spectrum, we also have the Burmese, really at the poverty level of 44K per year. And then you see the spread of other ethnic Asians, across the spectrum of income category. And you see this also reflected in the lower part of it in terms of the percentage of each ethnic group of people living in poverty levels, right? With Asian Indians at 6%. But, when you look at the Burmese population and the Mongolian population, it's as high as 25%, living under the poverty line. So this is really the income diversity that is reflected in the Asian American population, as well as the ethnic language diversity. I'm going to move on to talk a little bit about, the different ways in which Asian Americans, have been perceived, and why, some of this diversity of Asian Americans gets lost in the process because of these overwhelming stereotypes that exist in Asian in the U.S. sort of popular imagination. And one of the key ideas that that really permeate the way we perceive Asian Americans is the stereotype or the myth of the model minority. And again, the model minority is an image, a concept that emerges in a particular historical moment. It emerged in the 1960s in an article that was published in the New York Times Magazine. And the image here does not really correlate, with the actual article. But you see this persistent, the persistence of this image, of Asians as the whiz kids, the model minority. But at the origins, is quite early. It came out of an article by a sociologist talking about the success story of Japanese American style. And in that article, the sociologist was basically making the argument that that Japanese Americans offered a success story, of ethnic minority groups in the United States. And it is, and what he had associated that success with was around cultural values, family values of that is particular to Japanese Americans. However, when you break down the story, you realize that it is actually, a very narrow kind of perspective, and a story that does, really chooses certain characteristics to look at to make the argument that it is, the Japanese Americans, even after what happened with them with the incarceration of World War II, that they're able to succeed, based on hard work and based on family values, a heavy emphasis on education, etc. But this particular framework gained popularity. There were, of course, contesting narratives as well, but it gained sort of popular appeal because it was functioning in a period in 1960s, the social movements, and it used this image of Asian Americans to separate Asian Americans, from other racial ethnic minorities, to say, look, this is how Asian Americans were able to succeed, and if other groups had these values and cultural characteristics, then they would succeed too. However, this concept and this argument is extremely flawed, and let me show you how it is flawed. In many ways, the stereotype is based on claims, of Asian American success, which is a very small group, as we can see, or a very focused kind of particular focus on Asian Americans. They're also arguing that the claims are that they had all the right cultural characteristics for success. They're claiming that that they're quiet and non-disruptive, they're apolitical, they're great workers, but not particularly good leaders, because they don't take risks. They don't necessarily stand out, and speak up. And so these are the claims that persist, in our image of Asian Americans, and that's actually created certain barriers and boundaries for Asian Americans. And what you see, the way that this stereotype functions, is that it pits Asian Americans against other minorities. And in the 1960s period, this was useful because of the social movements that were emerging, and that were articulating the social needs of these of different minority groups, including Asian Americans, right? But again, it was trying to really divide, using the divide and conquer strategy here. The concept also homogenizes Asian American and Pacific Islander populations in a way that we see that all Asian Americans are successful, which is not true, but it homogenizes it, right? And makes us grasp, for this image, and it shifts the way we see AAPIs in general. It also erases Asian American political activism as a result of that. As well as systematically hides the structural and everyday forms of racism against Asian Americans. So it really does prevent Asian Americans from being seen and visible, in regards to the kinds of harms that have been exerted against them, and the ceilings that has been available against Asian Americans. And here, that discourse of minor minority is really, it hides many of the political activism and the political injustices that have been faced by Asian Americans. And you'll see that if we look at these images of iconic figures, of African American, Latinx sort of communities, we don't necessarily come to see or be able to locate, Asian American activists. But of course, if we look at these archival pictures, we see Asian Americans present, and in fact, extremely influential in the kinds of movements around Asian American rights and justice movements. I'm running out of time here, but I do want to just highlight other prevailing stereotypes that exist as well. The perpetual foreigner stereotypes, I think, where we often see as Asian Americans are understood as forever foreign, no matter how many times, how many generations Asian Americans have been present in the United States. And we're talking about, as early as the 1700s, right? So there are at least 8 plus or maybe 10 different generations of Asian Americans. And yet many of us are still considered perpetual foreigners. And of course, the yellow peril stereotypes that is even more harmful, which we're not only foreign, but we are a danger, right? Yellow peril stereotype presents Asian Americans as dangerous, as harmful, as threatening to the West. And I just want to point out that, you know, these images and stereotypes, again, do not come out of nowhere, do not come out of a vacuum, but in fact are saturated in the kinds of images that we receive in media, in literature, in films, in performances, etc., in graphic political cartoons. And you know, these are some of the images that I'm showing here. You know, Dr. Fu Manchu as a character that was created by Sax Rohmer, who is a British writer. But these series of Dr. Fu Manchu books became dispersed globally in the US, in Britain, and everywhere else. And this notion of this evil genius character, Dr. Fu Manchu, is still sort of permeates, you know, our popular consciousness. And you know, the series of novels were turned into Hollywood films and also performances, you know, in the late 1800s, early 1900s. You also had a similar character, the daughter, you know, of the dragon, for instance, the dragon lady, that, you know, also brought in the Asian women as you know, in a particular light. You also had images of Japan, you know, as being a yellow peril during World War II, and even as early, you know, as late as or as recent as the post 9/11, the image of South Asians or Sikhs or Arab Americans as being terrorists, you know, and threats to Asian Americans, and all this have implications, right? All these stereotypes actually have effects on the Asian American population. And so you see them enacted, you know, this rise of anti-Asian violence and hate have these long genealogies, going back to laws, going back to stereotypes that in fact, you know, have created the environments for World War II Japanese American incarceration, and also continued attacks, you know, even after 1950s, you have the incident of the murder of Vincent Chin in 1982, the post 9/11 attacks, and of course, the more recent uptick in the COVID-19 violence against Asian Americans. And in addition to that, a more silent wave of racial profiling of Asian American scientists and researchers today. And so, you know, when we were taking a survey, an overall survey on Asian Americans, only 29% of all Asian Americans agree that they are completely accepted in the United States. So that's less than a third of the population that see themselves as Asian Americans being accepted, you know, in the US society. So I just want to give a last slide here to really hone in on the key takeaways for this brief lecture, this brief workshop. That, you know, really Asian Americans are extremely diverse along ethnic lines, along income lines. We have a long historical presence since the 1700s. Some of the history and experiences that shape Asian Americans are, you know, not only labor and economic needs of the US that brought Asian Americans, but also immigration laws and citizenship laws that either enabled the wave of incoming, but also the exclusion of Asian Americans. And we also, you know, media representations also play a large role in shaping the perception and the treatment of Asian Americans. And of course, community activism and resilience on the Asian Americans' part in terms of building an infrastructure for themselves to resist and to also advance the population. You'll see the many different Asian immigrant contributions to the US, you know, in infrastructure building, in food, agriculture productions, scientific and medical innovations, entrepreneurship, healthcare, and service providers, and contributions to this overall contributions to the US growth, you really see as outweighing the population. Again, we are currently at 6% of the US population, but historically and at present, Asian Americans have played a large role in shaping the US economy and society and culture. So with that, I'm going to end